The autonomous Papua New Guinea region of Bougainville, which expects to have won its independence by 2027, has now drafted up a new constitution. That document is now being scrutinised throughout Bougainville. One of the people involved in the project as an advisor was Australian constitutional lawyer and academic Anthony Reagan. He told Don Wiseman the 2012 Fiji constitution, overseen by Kenyan academic Yash Gai, and which was later rejected by the Bainimarama regime, has been a key influence over the Bougainville document.
Part of the reason for that was that Yash Gai has been my mentor for the last 40 years. And he brought me in as a member of a three-member panel of experts to assess that draft constitution in early December 2012. So I had a copy of that draft constitution, which is now very difficult to obtain. So I had a copy and I provided that to the drafter, who was not aware of it, other than she was aware of it as a thing, but had never seen it. And she was deeply impressed by it. And much of the idea in it was of great interest to the Bougainville Constitutional Planning Commission as well. There are many other sources, Kenya, Papua New Guinea itself, and a range of other sources, but the Fiji one was significant.
But the Bougainville one does differ, as I understand it, or at least as far as the draft goes. There's a lot of emphasis on the handling of land, resources, and the environment.
Yes, it does. That was given a fair bit of attention in Fiji as well, but for very different reasons, because of the history of land issues in the racially divided, ethnically divided situation of Fiji. Bougainville is much more focused on dealing with the legacy of the mine and the exclusion of landowners from involvement in that.
How do you write environmental issues into the Constitution?
You are speaking as a New Zealander, I think. You can write anything into a constitution. The American tradition of constitutions is to have them very short. That's not the tradition that's developed now in post-colonial situations. Not so much with their original constitutions when they became independent. They tended to be fairly bare bones constitutions, particularly in the British system, not quite so much in the French. But after the initial constitutions, when things went bad and there was lots of conflict and other problems in the post-colonial states, they tended to develop much more comprehensive constitutions that sought to deal with the problems that they'd inherited from the colonial period. Papua New Guinea was one that was making its constitution quite late in the post-colonial period. The post-colonial constitution making started in the late 1940s with India, and then Africa and some of them in the 50s, and then in the 60s. Papua New Guinea developed theirs in 1972 to 1974 period. They learned a great deal from the post-colonial constitutions that had been developed post-independence, and they developed a very long and detailed constitution, and that dealt quite a bit with the environment, because even then in the early 70s, environmental issues are becoming quite significant. So if a country sees environment as a big problem, it deals with it in various ways in the constitution. There are modern constitutions where there's very specific rights of the environment to protection. So what they've done in Bougainville is not very dramatically different from a lot of others.
Right across the Bougainville region, there were consultations, but how much of a say did the ordinary Bougainvillean get?
I've been involved in participatory constitution making in a number of places. I worked for 3 years in Uganda on their constitution. What happens with people giving their views about constitutions is that usually they don't have a great deal of knowledge about what can go in a constitution. People tend to think that a constitution, when it's being made, provides the opportunity to sort out all of their immediate problems. And so they tend to have a lot of policy type recommendations given to them. But if you think carefully about what you're being told by ordinary people in this way, they give you a real picture about what the real problems of a country are. You then tend to try and design your constitution to a large extent around that picture. That doesn't mean that people don't have strong views about particular issues. For example, in Bougainville, corruption and mismanagement in the public sector was a strong theme coming through. And that's now being heavily reflected in the Constitution. So there are a number of things like that where people's views did have a significant impact. Another one would be the role of customary authority, land and environment, as you're saying. The Constitution-making Commission is heavily influenced by what it heard from the people.
Now, the ABG legislature has got this quite remarkable situation where they have 3 seats reserved for women, 3 seats reserved for former militants. My impression was, at the beginning, that was a transitory thing, that they were going to be done away with at some point. But I get the impression from what I've seen of the draft that those seats will stay for, well, some time.
Yes, the women's seats, there was never any intention that they would be time limited necessarily. The ex-combatants, the proposal in the 2004 Constitution was that they should cease after the referendum was held. So it was felt at that time that the ex-combatants should have a role in ensuring that things did happen in accordance with the peace agreement, because there was some uncertainty in people's minds about whether a referendum really would occur, and it was felt that they had in some ways a right to be involved. When the preparations were being made for the 2020 elections after the referendum, there was a move to remove the ex-combatant seats going forward, and that move was defeated by an amendment in the Constitution. That was defeated, and they were kept. There's never been a further revision, a further consideration of that.
There will have to be at some point, of course, because you're going to run out of former combatants.
Indeed, at some point in the future. It's a bit of a surprise that that was agreed to go forward in the Independence Constitution if it's eventually adopted. And the thinking was that it would now become veterans, and that other veterans, such as of the police, and possibly if there's a Bougainville defence force of some sort established, then that they might be also eligible for those seats. But it's still a little bit unclear how that will all work out. Yes. What you have in May, of course, is a first draft, and that's now under review through a widespread consultation process. And I don't know what the reaction of the ordinary people will be to the continuation of those seats. That could get revised. I think the women's seats are most unlikely to be abolished anyway. I think they're most likely to go forward.
What sort of feedback has there been, if any, from the rest of PNG?
Not a great deal publicly. I think there's quite a bit of discussion on social media, which is very mixed, as you might imagine. From what I'm hearing, I don't follow social media very closely, but that's what people tell me. There's been very little comment in the press. It's a bit unclear so far. The public debate about the future of Bougainville is rather muted.